Welcome to the Mike White Podcast, where I, Mike White, share my conversations and book reviews through my journey to learn all that goes on in this amazing world. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. All right, we're back for another week of the Mike White Podcast. I have the pleasure of welcoming MacroJack's to the pod. You can find him on Twitter at MacroJack21, and he's the author of the Fiat Cave Substack, fiatcave.substack.com. Jackson, thanks for coming out.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Good to be here.
Yeah, well, we met at Bitcoin events here in Austin, and it's great seeing people with like shared values. So that's one of my favorite things about being in Austin. I want to learn about as many people as I can. So we'll start out with your story of getting into Bitcoin. What'd you do growing up? Like, were you interested in finance, like in going into college, or when did you kind of get that bug?
Yeah, so my interest in finance stemmed, I think, from my interest in money. And it wasn't necessarily the interest in money from a first principles or philosophical aspect that draws many people into Bitcoin, but more so the idea of chasing money and that fiat mindset, and just kind of seeing how people in the financial services industry did very well. And I guess growing up it was something that I aspired to, was having nicer things and kind of chasing that. And I thought that there was a exciting career to make. So sometime in high school, I forget exactly when, I became interested in having a career in finance, but it was also twofold, where my dad and my mom both grew up working class, and they've worked very hard to be in the position that they are today. And they always kind of instilled in me good financial principles and just personal finance, principles. So just kind of been ingrained in me at a young age. And I had other interests as well growing up. At one point, I thought I was interested in computer science and maybe wanted to go down that route. But ultimately, I think it just made more sense as I was more math inclined, and I, again, wanted to make a lot of money. So I was kind of drawn to the financial services industry. And then I ended up going to a large state school for college that has a fairly good business program. And one thing led to another. In those 4 years, I got a degree in finance and, learned quite a bit. Also, really didn't learn anything in terms of economics. As you know, if you've studied anything remotely close in college, you learn a lot about Keynesian economics. But so then I moved up to New York and started the career in finance, and happy to get into that as well. But I guess just through those early years of my life and having those principles instilled upon me by my parents, and also just wanting to do well for myself financially, I was drawn to that industry.
Yeah, that always amazes me, because everyone grows up very differently about what kind of lifestyle they have growing up. So you said you had two working class parents. So I guess, would you consider yourself like a middle class child growing up, or if you wanted, like, say that new gaming system, is that something that you just got, or were there like, you have to work this much, do these chores, or how was that growing up?
Yeah, so I would say that not necessarily middle class, probably grew up upper middle class.
Yeah.
My parents both were working class. They were both the first generation to be college educated in their families. And my mom has a background in theater, actually.
Oh, wow.
So her passion was theater and the arts, and that's what she pursued. And then my dad first started out in accounting, and worked at a CPA firm, and then he actually ended up working at the FBI for 20 years in counterintelligence. Yeah. So we moved around a lot, not too much. I mean, I grew up in New York, Northern Virginia, and then Philadelphia. Grew up mostly in Philadelphia, and then I would say, I had kind of a upper middle class upbringing in terms of getting what I wanted. There were expectations of doing things around the house, but we never really were struggling, thankfully. My parents always worked really hard to provide for me and my sister, and it's something that I'll always be grateful for. And fortunately, we had it pretty good growing up, that we didn't really ever have to worry about not having food on the table, or my parents not being able to pay the mortgage or anything like that.
So what do you take away from that, like of how to have a good relationship with money from an early age? Because a lot of people don't. A lot of people go into college, you get in a ton of college debt, and they're just constantly on this hamster wheel of maybe never getting out of debt and spending outside their means, things like that. What principles do you think you learn that have benefited you so far?
You got to live below your means. That was something that my dad taught me from a very young age, where people have that lifestyle creep, right? Where they start making more and more money, and then they just want to have nicer and nicer things, and they see other people doing something, or driving a nice car, or taking these different types of vacations. And, it's important to enjoy life and treat yourself when you have the means to, but it's also really important to ground yourself in your financial reality and live below your means, because at any time, really, you could, in my instance, I'm employed, and I could easily be laid off today or tomorrow at any point, right? So you need to have some sort of security blanket in terms of savings. The whole point of saving is to kind of buffer yourself against future uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And it's extremely important, in my opinion, and something that I learned, to just live below your means and not really chase what other people are doing.
Nice.
Yeah.
So now you're saying you're into like finance in college, and you get a job in New York. So are you on like working for a bank on Wall Street, or what kind of job was that?
Not that sexy. Yeah. So let's see. College, studied finance, and then I did pretty well in college. I did kind of the work hard, play hard sort of thing, and ended up moving to New York. I worked at one of the larger financial institutions in Manhattan. I did work in the internal audit department, which was less than glamorous. So it wasn't like I was doing sales and trading or investment banking, one of these really high roller, extremely coveted jobs in the Fiat financial world.
The Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah. I was doing internal audit, which was not exciting. It wasn't exciting for me, at least. And I think for most people who do audit, they don't like it, but it's a necessary evil. So it was pretty miserable moving to New York and being in that role. It was kind of every day I was trying to figure out how I was going to get out of it. So what I ended up doing was studying for the CFA, which is the Certified Financial Analyst exam, kind of the gold standard in the investment management business. And I passed the first part of that, which allowed me to leverage that credential to then get a better job. So then I ended up working in hedge fund and private equity research, which was more exciting. Getting to get in front of portfolio managers who had very exotic financial strategies and learn from them. And it was quite interesting. It's pretty insane that all of these strategies are really just to beat inflation. And it's crazy, to what degree people are going to do that now. But it's still quite interesting before you're fully orange pilled, right? And understand Bitcoin. To me, it was pretty interesting to learn about different hedge fund strategies, whether it's equity long short or relative value or multi-strategy or different like private equity or private real estate strategy. So I was kind of a generalist in the alternative investment space and got to learn a lot of different investment strategies, speak to smart people, get to speak to financial advisors. Essentially, we were doing research on behalf of the financial advisor base as an alternative investment due diligence team to recommend different investment products and then also monitor our current recommended list to ensure that, they're delivering performance to their clients. Something I haven't mentioned yet was Bitcoin. So I need to take a step back because in 2017, I was first introduced to Bitcoin, and I was a senior in college, and I was actually either working on a homework assignment or studying for an exam, and a guy in my fraternity who was really interested in options trading and just, shitcoining and speculating had told me about Bitcoin, and this was in the run-up to the highs in 2017. So I think he told me in August it was trading about 3,000 or 4,000 a coin. I had no idea what he was talking about, but it sounded like a good idea at the time. So I bought $200 worth of Bitcoin, and then I kind of watched that go up to whatever it was, $800 by the time Bitcoin peaked out in November of 2017. And then I watched it come crashing down, and I was like, whatever. It was, $200. It wasn't a ton of money to me. So I just kind of held on to it, and I didn't think much of it. And then when I moved to New York in 2018, and kind of while I was trying to navigate the fiat financial world, I started to learn more about Bitcoin. I actually had run into Marty Bent in 2018 in New York and subscribed to his newsletter. Yeah. And then
where'd you run into him?
So he and I went to the same high school.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah. He's a bit older than I am, so I didn't know him. But I met him at like a happy hour event because kind of to tie this all together, I was miserable in my first job at school. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go to this happy hour event and try to meet some people, see if I can, make some good connections, learn from people, maybe land an interview somewhere.
Yeah.
Better than my current situation. And so I went by myself, and Marty was there with some of his friends from his class, and I got to meet him.
Was he talking your ear off about Bitcoin?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for the better, right? And
do you remember his pitch? Like what he
I really,
highlighted?
No, I don't. It was, so this was in 2018. So it was kind of the earlier days, I guess, of his newsletter and podcast. So I subscribed to the newsletter, and I was less diligent than I should have been in terms of reading it. I would probably read, an issue here or there. But he also told me about some other resources like the Bitcoin Standard and the Bullish Case for Bitcoin by BJ Boy Potty. So, as I became more and more interested in it, I had the resources at my fingertips to learn about it because I had the privilege of getting to meet Marty and at least having, some guidance in the space. Right. So that was, I guess, like 2018, 2019, started learning more about it. And then things really started to click, and I paid a lot more attention 2020 and on.
Yeah. So even just knowing about all those resources, like Marty could tell you, read this book, read that book, read the newsletter, you're still busy. You're trying to transition careers and spending time on the CFA. What was it about Bitcoin that kind of kept you interested and not just pushed it aside? Like nowadays, I tell someone about Bitcoin, I can't, maybe a minute I can talk about it before they're totally uninterested and they want to talk about something else.
Yeah. So admittedly, it was a price action, I think. Yeah. Even though the price action was awful in 2018 and 2019, it was a bear market and kind of traded sideways for a while. I was at least kind of bought into the idea that this was a good investment opportunity, and still thinking about it in kind of the fiat financial, the broader landscape, right, of portfolio diversification and thinking through all of that. So it was like, it makes sense for me to purchase this. It's a digital hard money, digital gold. There's definitely redeeming qualities about it, and it doesn't hurt for me to have some exposure to it. But then it was really in 2020 where I was working this job doing hedge fund and private equity research in New York, and the world, started to shut down. And in 2020, I moved back home, had a lot more time on my hands, and started to dig into the Bitcoin stuff. So, this is almost 2 years after I met Marty and started to kind of dabble more into it and build, a little bit more of a position into Bitcoin. And by then I was kind of seeing everything that was happening in the world, where the governments were locking down global economies, and there was a ton of money printing, which was benefiting the financial markets. So it was actually benefiting me and the industry that I was working in. But meanwhile, I'm kind of walking around and seeing all these businesses closed, either temporarily or permanently. And it got me disenfranchised with the system, because I really got to see it play out right in front of me in terms of just the government and central banks picking winners and losers. So that was, a real eye opener for me. And it was also the fact that I was out of New York, where there's a ton of distractions just living in New York and having a lot of friends there, and, going out and socializing. And then moving back home, where there was really nothing for me to do in the suburbs and the entire world was shut down. So I found my way to Twitter, and, one thing leads to another in terms of finding interesting people both on the Bitcoin space and then also just kind of the macro space. And everything started to make sense from that point forward in 2020.
And you talk about how the firm you were working for was thriving in this environment, whereas everyday consumers kind of get hurt. And so did you put that inflation together of the money printing and how that would trickle down and how it affect the whole economy? Or when did you kind of realize how that affected inflation?
Yeah, so I kind of understood it immediately because of just the implications of expanding the money supply by 40% in about 18 months. So I was listening at that time, I was pretty in on Bitcoin and sound money, but I was also still quite interested in the traditional markets in early 2020 and during this period of early COVID. And I found my way to podcasts and shows like Macro Voices, where they would have you heard of it?
No.
Okay.
No.
So it's a weekly show, and it hosted by this oil hedge fund guy, Eric Townsend, and it was really interesting for me because I think he brings on a lot of interesting guests, like Luke Groman is one that a lot of Bitcoiners know. And so I started to hear Luke and Lynn Alden and all of these really smart people in the macro space on his show, let's say Q1, Q2 of 2020, all of whom were pretty dialed in on what was going on from the monetary policy side. So I kind of understood the implications of lowering interest rates to 0% and then printing trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I found my way to these people because I'm sure if I was listening to CNBC, I would be completely oblivious to the implications of that. But it was pretty remarkable to see how much power there was that these governments had over their people in 2020, and just local jurisdictions, some worse than others, and shutting down businesses, and really just seeing in my own firm, or not my own firm, but the firm I was working for, just seeing these hedge fund strategies do really well. Essentially, you were just like long equity hedge fund managers that were long technology stocks and all this other stuff. They just saw their returns. They had like high double digits, even some triple digit returns in 2020. Meanwhile, it was starting to become apparent that there were going to be serious implications of higher prices of goods and services in the real economy, just as when people are having their revenues kind of halted to zero.
Yep. Yeah. So you wrote about that recently too, which I think is one of the, I guess, first off, how do you explain to a person that, wears a mask by themselves in their car? This is who we're talking to. How do you explain how the government actually prints money? Because I don't think people, I don't know if it's not known, or because once I learned that, is that because it doesn't go to everyone, right? Like it's not even. So how do they decide who gets these extra units, and why is that unfair? Like if you had to explain to a fifth grader.
Yeah. So how I'd explain that is the U.S. Treasury, they issue bonds. So they're issuing bonds, which means that they are essentially trying to raise capital from investors who want to purchase their bonds. So I'm going to give them $100 today, and in return, I'm going to have essentially an IOU. And sometime in the future, I'll get my $100 back, and over time, I'll get some interest on that as well. So the U.S. government is looking for people to purchase its bonds so then they can essentially inject money into the real economy. And the way that works is they're primary dealer banks. So they're essentially like the largest banks in the United States. They go to they have a relationship with the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve, and essentially the U.S. Treasury will have an auction. So they'll be like, we're trying to issue this much debt. The primary dealers will purchase it, and then they essentially sell it to the Federal Reserve, which is creating money from nothing. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but on the margin, that's what is happening. Yeah. And then, they take the government debt onto their balance sheet, the Federal Reserve does, and then the government has money to kind of play around with. And, then it's kind of it comes down to their capital allocation strategy and how they choose to allocate it. And they kind of get to pick winners and losers. And then also, part of this is driving down interest rates artificially. So the U.S. government, they have to pay interest on their debt obligations in order to bring investors in that want to purchase their debt. But if the Federal Reserve is just kind of setting the price of interest to be 0%, then they're manipulating the cost of capital for everything. So
Yeah.
essentially all the financial markets are based on a completely fraudulent basis of 0% interest rates.
When did you start questioning the validity of having a Federal Reserve? Because it wasn't always a thing, right? We used to have private banks, and now my understanding is that the government didn't like J.P. Morgan or a big bank having so much power, because there was a crisis, and J.P. Morgan pretty much bailed them out with his own money, bailed other banks out, and because he realized it was in his best interest that these banks stayed afloat through that kind of hardship. And the government thought, that's not great. We should have that power, not a JP Morgan like thing. And so they created the Federal Reserve. I don't know if there's more to that, but when did you kind of question the validity of the Federal Reserve?
2020 and was probably the first time. I was too young to understand anything that was going on in 2008 during the financial crisis. I was in middle school, so I was too busy playing Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 2 to know what was happening in the banking system. But probably in 2020, because up until that point, I was just doing what I needed to do to get by in my education, so in high school and college. And then when you're working on Wall Street and you're working in New York, you're benefiting from that system, so you don't really have no incentives to question it. And it wasn't until I was kind of removed from that in 2020, moved back to the suburbs, and then had a lot of time on my hands to start thinking through things. And I pretty much came to the conclusion that it makes no sense that 12 Federal Reserve board members can determine what interest rates are for a global economy of 8 billion people.
Yeah, and I think people understand that when it comes to prices. If you had a group that said, okay, we're going to set the price of bread at this number and meet every so often to assess this price of bread and change it, like that would be silly. And the interest rate is something that affects everything. It's almost more powerful than just setting a price of items, and it's not questioned at all. So that's scary. But you were talking about how like equities and assets like real estate or stuff like that are maintaining their value throughout, because that's where they're getting return. You have your hurdle rate, you have to beat inflation, and you have to invest. Whereas if you're just saving your money, you're getting left behind and getting eaten alive by inflation. How does that relate to kind of the housing market nowadays? And do people our age ever maybe, just getting their first job, do they ever have any chance of getting their first house?
Man, it's pretty grim, I would say, for first-time home buyers. So I'm 26 years old. I'm engaged. So my fiance and I would like to buy a home probably in the next year or so. And we both do pretty well. But it's just absolutely insane how expensive homes are. Just kind of going on the fact of median housing prices versus median income in the United States. The median housing price is about 7x of the median income in the United States, compared to 1971 when the gold standard was ended. It was about 2.5 times. So it's already on paper much more expensive. Just comparing income versus the price of a house.
Yeah.
But then you kind of factor in all-time high prices of houses, and then also much higher interest rates now, about 5% interest, or 5% set by the Federal Reserve, but mortgage rates are probably closer to 6 or 7%. I don't know where exactly they are. So if you're looking at a home in pretty much any metro area, maybe a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, at least what I've seen in the Northeast, it's probably going to be somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. So then you throw like a 7% mortgage rate on that, and there's really almost no way that anyone could start a family on a single income in the United States currently. And it's just not possible.
And what's crazy is your house gets worse over time. Like in an ideal system, your house should depreciate. And now more than ever, you don't need to be in the city centers. You don't need to be close to where you work, where most people can go just hop online wherever and work. The fact that houses still are going up is, I think, just shows how much government involvement there is, like you said, in the monetary supply, which is huge. And also just, I think zoning laws are also a big thing, and the regulations and actually what kind of houses can be built. There's a ton of regulations, like you must have these, if you have this much square feet, you have to have this many bathrooms, and each bathroom has to have this and this. And there's so much red tape that causes inefficiency that it disincentivizes the supply to go up and more scarcity. I think it's just compounding factors.
Yeah. Plus, when inflation is high as well, it's much more challenging to develop anything, right? Because all the input costs are much higher. So not only is the existing inventory becoming more expensive, but there's also less incentive for developers to create new homes because of how expensive it is to build. Yeah.
And now if you are trying to save up for that house, where are you going to put your money? Like if you put your money in your savings account, you're never going to catch up. Your inflation's going way higher than what you can get on your returns. So you're going to have to take risky moves to maybe play the stock market or Bitcoin or something like that. But you don't want to have it in savings with this inflation. And I can see that just being, really can crush a lot of people. Just think, oh, I have no chance. Like, why even try?
Yeah, so it's a great point, and that's what I think is underappreciated as well now is people's savings mechanism changes over time. Before, so in 1933, private gold ownership was banned. Yeah, as a private citizen, you cannot own gold. So the government confiscated people's gold in 1933, or they were subject to a $10,000 fine, which was quite a large amount of money back then, or I think maybe 5 or 10 years of prison time.
Yeah.
So
that's just for owning. Better run.
That's for owning a yellow rock.
Yeah.
Right. It's absolutely insane. So because of that, people had to find another way to save. So when I think about my grandparents, I have one living grandparent, my grandmother. She's 94.
Holy cow!
And
that's awesome.
Yeah, and she's still pretty healthy too.
That's great.
So that's awesome. But yeah, when I think about how growing up, they would give me like a savings bond, right? When I was very young, and essentially you would just buy it at a discount to the par value of the bond. So if it's like a $50 bond, you'd buy, I don't know what you'd buy it at, but it would be at a discount, and then eventually it would mature and it would be worth whatever the par value was. So back in, whatever, the 40s, 50s, 60s, people had different ways of saving. So the savings bond, because inflation wasn't always as bad as it is today, people would maybe actually be able to save in a savings account or purchase a government security and save that way. Like for instance, in the 1980s, interest rates were whatever, 15% or so. So you could actually get a pretty nice interest rate on just having a savings account or having, a large exposure to government securities.
Yeah.
But then as we kind of look at the boomers and, our parents' age, interest rates start trending downward. And there's reasons for that are legitimate, and then there's reasons for that are illegitimate. So, like demographics, technology, and also globalization, all kind of deflationary forces that were forcing interest rates down to an extent. But then every time there's been a financial crisis, the Federal Reserve and central banks have intervened and lowered rates artificially. So people have had to go out on the risk curve essentially to protect themselves against inflation, because no longer can you just purchase a government bond or have a savings account. You need to have equity exposure, right? So then there was the popularization of the 60-40 portfolio, which is the de facto savings account of the United States. Mm-hmm. And now I think we're already kind of seeing that break down in 2022. That was a really bad year for the 60-40. I think it was maybe the third or fourth year in history that both equities and fixed income were down double digits, something like that.
Bonds just got hit hard, right?
Yeah. Because if you think about it, when interest rates go up, if you own a bond that yields 0% and then interest rates 12 months later are 5%, your bond that yields 0% is going to be someone would only want to buy that at a discount, right? Why would they want to buy that at par value if they could buy something else that's going to yield them 5%?
Yeah.
So when interest rates go up, bond values go down, and it also hurt equity values as well. So 2022 is a bad year for the 60-40 portfolio. And I think a lot of people are scrambling to figure out how they're going to save their money if we're kind of moving into a new paradigm where the 60-40 is rendered ineffective.
Yeah.
And that's why, I mean, it's obviously Bitcoin.
It's obviously Bitcoin.
But a lot of people haven't come to that conclusion yet.
And so one thing that people don't like or are scared of Bitcoin, and you mentioned with gold, the government just said it one day, okay, we're going to ban gold. You guys can't own gold. Now people are, and I think they have a good point. The government may someday in the future, I think it will happen. They'll say, okay, we're going to ban Bitcoin. And why is that different than a ban on gold in your view? Or how would a Bitcoiner see that?
Well, I would say that since it's not a physical asset, you are able to store Bitcoin in your head, and you're also able to cross borders without really anyone being able to know if you own Bitcoin or not. So I think if the United States were to take that approach to Bitcoin in terms of banning private ownership of it and really tried to clamp down on it, a lot of people with a lot of capital would leave the United States, and it would put them at a disadvantage geopolitically. I really don't think it's going to happen. I think there's just too many people with money in the U.S. that already have exposure to Bitcoin. And I think it's also probably in the United States' best interest as they have their U.S. dollar reserve currency hegemony challenged by other people. And, that system is kind of coming to an end, although it'll probably take a while to play out. It's probably in the best interest of the U.S. to be pro-Bitcoin.
I hope you're right. I
hope
hope you're right. And I think it's key what you said there too, is that you could store your Bitcoin in your head. You just need to know your seed phrase. And if you're trying to leave the country with your gold, they're going to take their cut. They're going to find it on you. You can't hide that much gold. But Bitcoin, you can take your whole savings with you if you just memorize your seed phrase.
Yeah, and I would also add on that too. When governments get desperate, they try a lot of things, and one of them is capital controls. So they don't want capital to leave the country. And it's much easier to enforce capital controls if you have all of your money in regulated financial institutions, right? Mm-hmm. Because they could just say, well, that is your money, but you can't withdraw more than $1,000 from your bank account. Or, you have that brokerage account, but it's for the national security interests of the United States, you can't sell your equities or something, right? Like, it's much easier to just go in and regulate a financial institution that's already custodying trillions of dollars of wealth versus trying to go to each individual and, prove that they own an asset that is digital, where they, there's really no physical trace of it beyond maybe a hardware wallet or seed phrase somewhere. And if you need to, you can leave the country, and you can't really, there's no way that someone could stop you at TSA and be like, oh, this guy has Bitcoin.
Yeah. And like you said, most people have to rely on Chase Bank. If you have all your money in Chase Bank, and you have to go through them, even though you think it's your money, it could switch with the government and Chase. They can take that from you very easily. And Bitcoin, you can be your own bank, but that depends on how you hold your Bitcoin. So what does not your keys, not your coins mean to you?
Yeah, so it means exactly what you said. If you don't actually take custody of your Bitcoin, you don't own it. And I think you're better off trusting some firms than others. Like I would say River, if you have been lazy and you haven't taken your Bitcoin off of River's platform, you're probably good, and you should still take steps to get to self-custody. But, you could trust River much more than you could trust FTX, right?
Yeah.
But the whole point of Bitcoin is to not trust anyone. So I think everyone should kind of get to the point where they feel comfortable to start taking custody of their Bitcoin, which just means purchasing a hardware wallet, writing down your seed phrase, or storing it another way, right? You can be very creative with how you store your seed phrase.
Yeah.
And then, Yeah, and then you own it. Otherwise, you kind of have an IOU, and an institution like FTX, they say that you have a certain amount of Bitcoin on exchange, but you have no idea what they're actually doing with it. They could be rehypothecating it, so lending it out, essentially fractional reserve banking on Bitcoin. And one day, it's not there when you want it. So you just got to take the steps. It could be a little daunting at first, I would say, but there's just so many resources out there and people, that have made great content to really walk people through step by step on how to do it.
Yeah, and it's not as convenient as just logging in and clicking a button and then saying I'm good if you just use an exchange, but you're trading that convenience for more security, less risk. And I think especially if you hold any large amount, you should start really going down that self-sovereignty rabbit hole of holding your own keys. And then one thing that got me, so I still didn't trust myself when I learned, I was learning about Bitcoin. I loved it, but I was like, I don't really want to buy Bitcoin because if I get it on this hardware wallet, I'm going to lose this thing. I'm going to forget it. It's going to get stolen and then all my Bitcoin's away. Like if I had a large amount, I would not feel comfortable with that. But then I learned about multisig. So I don't know what's your take on multisig? Do you like it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems to be a great solution. I've actually haven't used multisig myself, but from what I've learned and from the firms that provide those solutions, such as Unchained Capital, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's a great way to distribute some responsibility among different parties. And, I think there's still quite a bit of a learning curve to it. I can't speak from experience, but I just understanding how to get it set up. There's definitely a learning curve to multisig and, having multiple wallets control the keys of the Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But I think if people are a little worried to have that much responsibility and have full ownership of their wealth, there are solutions out there that exist. Something that I'm excited about is OnRamp, which is a new firm that was launched a couple weeks ago by Jesse Myers and Michael Tanguma. They're essentially providing I don't want to speak for them, but essentially they're providing an even easier, more accessible solution for people who are not even ready to take the multisig approach yet.
Okay.
So that's a cool firm for people to check out as well. I think it's only available to accredited investors at the moment.
Is that the Croesus Jesse Myers?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I like he does macro analysis, right? Is that what you would consider it?
Yeah, he's a really smart guy.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I like Unchained too, because they'll dummy proof it for you but even if Unchained goes down, it's not like you lose your Bitcoin. You can still have access to your funds. They just hold that third key, 203 multisig. And then the other thing I heard about is you could have your keys in you have jurisdictional arbitrage, or they call it, where maybe you have one in El Salvador locked up, and then you have one in the States. So even if the States somehow find your keys, they can't get your one in El Salvador. So there's ways if you're really paranoid to hold your money securely. So going down this Bitcoin journey, what was your biggest kind of roadblock or thing you doubted the most? Or was it all just full force? This is amazing. I want to get as much as I can.
Yeah. I guess there's been a lot of, not necessarily roadblocks, but you just have to learn so much when you're learning about Bitcoin. So when we were talking about it a bit earlier and just how gradual the process was for me, I sit here now in 2023 and I know a lot about Bitcoin. I don't know all there is to know about it. And there's people who are way more savvier than I am in the Bitcoin space. But, I feel comfortable and pretty satisfied with the amount of knowledge that I've accrued. But it's also been about 5 years of a journey of learning about it and, the technology of it, the importance of it, sound money. And really, it's just such a long process that I think a lot of people don't appreciate that haven't really gone on that journey themselves. At this point, I don't really see any major risks to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
barring like a end of the world type situation.
No, definitely. And I like how there's a lot of the podcasts out there that there's people constantly trying to break it, constantly trying to figure out any of the holes, and you see some of these crazy theories, and it's good to know. But I also think Bitcoin is definitely the most secure of the cryptocurrencies, mainly because of the decentralization aspect. That's why that was the big thing for me of shitcoin versus Bitcoin, because I owned some Ethereum back in the day when I thought, oh, these NFT things are kind of cool. Like, how do I buy NFT? I got to get this Ethereum. And which I don't know. I'm still open to maybe there be a coexisting of Bitcoin and maybe some other shitcoins that have their own special use case. What are your thoughts? And like, do you see any value of shitcoins, or when did you go Bitcoin only?
So I don't see any value in shitcoins.
Yeah.
And that's because probably 99% of them aren't valuable. They're just scams, or they're trying to be something that they're not. They're securities and they're pretending not to be securities.
Yeah.
But I will say I don't really spend any time trying to understand other projects, right?
Yeah.
Outside of Bitcoin. So potentially there are some solutions out there, but really what it all comes back to is the monetary system and understanding what's wrong with the current monetary system. And Bitcoin is the only one that would be suitable for money. And I think before we go and tackle other issues that may exist out there, we kind of have to get the money in check first.
Yeah. I think Michael Saylor was the one that kind of hit that home for me, is where he talked about all these altcoins, and either they have pre-mining or they have CEOs or some foundation, and all these aspects where they're companies, and Bitcoin is totally different. It is in a league its own with how it was founded and how proof of work, and Satoshi Nakamoto there is no Bitcoin CEO. It's all decentralized, all based off of these principles that I think it is definitely clearly separate than the shitcoins. What about so the other thing, fractional reserve banking. So this is where I disagree with a lot of Bitcoiners. I think it's fine. I think in a free banking system, you should be able to choose if you want to give your money to a fractionally reserved bank or a full reserve bank, as long as they're transparent about it. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
That's an interesting idea. And I think, yeah, I mean, ideally, right, in a free market for financial services and banking, that could exist. The issue is we don't have a free market. And I don't know if you've followed Caitlin Long at all in Custodia and what she's trying to do with a full reserve bank.
108%.
Yeah, I mean,
reserve.
Yeah, she's essentially being told that she can't do that because there's an incentive for there not to be full reserve banks, because people would start to understand what fractional reserve banking is and that they could deposit their savings with a bank that isn't doing that. And that could create a run on the banks, because people don't necessarily want all of their money to be lent out and then not be able to get it during a bank run. So I think that's an interesting idea, that perhaps in a free banking world, that there would be both fractional reserve banking and then also full deposit banking. As a customer of the banks, you'd probably be spending you'd have higher fees associated with full reserve banking, because a lot of the reason why banks are lending out deposits is because they are chasing the yield, right? So I think people would be very comfortable, though, with paying more fees for a more secure banking relationship.
Yeah, that's really scary with Caitlin Long and how not free our banking system is. How she's just trying to trade with other people. She'll I'll hold your money. It's safe here. You can use me as a bank. And she's going through all the proper, channels of regulation, and they still shot her down. So if anyone thinks we're in a free market, that's one of the best proofs that the banking system is not free.
And if anyone thinks we're in a free market, you should also realize that central banks are a communist entity. And Karl Marx actually wrote about central banking in his Communist Manifesto.
Oh gosh, I didn't realize that. He's loving it. But so also in your Substack, talk a lot about macro, Bitcoin. Is really in-depth material. I highly recommend everyone go check out the Fiat Cave. You also have something about your Bitcoin journey and your or generational wealth and generational health. So when did you start really valuing your health side? So you always, think about the money, and when did you like, okay, I also need to make sure I'm living my best life?
That was a fairly recent realization for me. So growing up, I played sports growing up, did football and baseball, basketball, soccer. So stayed pretty active throughout grade school, middle school. And then my mom's actually always been quite fit and was always really into fitness and exercise. And so I did have that influence, but I think where I was kind of led astray was I associated eating healthy to be really boring, right? So it's like, oh, you got to eat grilled chicken and broccoli and salmon. And, if you're 13 or 14 years old, it's not going to be most exciting to most teenagers. So I kind of went off on my own journey of starting to rebel against that. And I would always eat pretty unhealthy at school, in high school, and got really into drinking later in high school. And then that kind of continued throughout college. I went to a large state school, so pretty perverse drinking culture.
Yeah.
So, I was actually pretty fat in college, to be honest. I'm probably about 40 pounds lighter than I was.
How much? Do you remember the number?
Yeah, man. It's probably about 220.
220, and you're like 5'10".
And I'm about 170 now. So I guess
wow.
it's 50
That's
pounds.
significant. Yeah. Holy cow. And that wasn't too long. You're only 26, so that couldn't have been too long ago.
Yeah. So I was pretty fat in college. Just
the alcohol.
Just gorging on processed food and alcohol.
Yeah.
And what's really was the killer is not only drinking like 12 beers, in the evening, but then also just eating a ton of food after doing that too.
Yeah.
So it was just a very unhealthy lifestyle. And, so I was doing that for a while, and then even into New York, that lifestyle kind of continued. A lot of eating out and a lot of drinking. And because in New York, a lot of, at least in my experience, is a lot of people's lives just revolves around eating and drinking.
Yeah.
More so than other cities, especially during the winter, right? Because you're kind of trapped in the city and there's not a lot to do outside.
And no one has any space in their apartments, right? They're all so small.
Yeah. So right. Exactly. You don't want to be in your apartment that much because your apartment sucks.
Yeah.
Like my fiance, my girlfriend at the time, she lived in a walk up on the 6th floor, and she had some mice issues and some cockroach issues. So you just, you don't want to spend time there, even though you're spending so much money to live there. So you end up going out a lot and just eating. You're not really controlling the food that you're putting in your body, and you're paying $15 for a cocktail, several cocktails. And then, so what really wasn't actually until 2019 or technically 2020. So it was New Year's Eve of 2019 going into 2020. And I suffered a concussion, which I'll let you infer how that could have happened on New Year's Eve.
Was alcohol involved?
It was.
Was it scooter? Or do you have scooters in New York?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't scooters.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just very drunk, and so I got a concussion and then had to take a lot of time off of work. About 2 months, a little less than 2 months. And so this was in January and February of 2020. Spent a lot of time kind of reassessing my life, and I couldn't drink, which disqualified me from the social life of New York City.
Yeah.
So what I ended up doing was just reading a lot and going for a lot of walks in Central Park. I just wasn't working, so I would just,
awesome.
Walk around the park for several hours each day, listen to a podcast, or just sit on a bench, read a book or something. Because I don't know if you've had a concussion, have you?
No, I've seen my buddies have, though.
Yeah, so you can't really do too much.
No.
You're not supposed to be looking at screens, really not supposed to be reading initially either. You're not supposed to put any stress on your body or your mind. So you're fairly limited in what you can do. So that was really the eye-opening moment for me where I was like, all right, I got to figure out a better way forward and figure out how I want to make some changes in my life to be a healthier person. So that happened, and then COVID happened, where I then moved out of the city and had a lot of time to just work on my habits. So I started eating a lot cleaner, a lot of walking, started exercising more, just kind of doing some running, some calisthenics. And over time, I mean, so that was in 2020, and then 2021 and 2022, I started to become quite interested in health because of Twitter, actually. Just kind of coming across people that were talking about interesting ideas, and it was a lot more exciting, and it wasn't as boring as just eating chicken and broccoli. Like now I eat a lot of what I want to eat, but I'm just not fat anymore because I exercise and make sure that I'm, hitting 10,000 steps every day at a minimum. I'm exercising 4 times a week or so. I'm eating pretty clean. I cook a lot of my food. So I'm using clean ingredients. I'm eating whole foods, and it tastes delicious. Like I was just making I was slow cooking a pork shoulder that I got from Amber Oaks Ranch.
Shout out to John.
Yeah. And made some carnitas, and man, it's phenomenal. Right. So I was kind of led to believe that eating healthy and being a healthy person sucked.
Yeah.
In the sense of you had to really constrain yourself in terms of what you ate and what you did, and you couldn't have any fun. But in reality, it makes life so much more enjoyable because you can do everything that you want to do within reason. And really, I got interested again because of Marty. So apparently Marty has been influential in my life because on TFTC, he had Texas Slim on of the Beef Initiative, and that was probably about 18 months ago or so, give or take. And there was this convergence of the ranching and agriculture and Bitcoin. And I found that to be really interesting. I actually work at an agricultural investment firm now.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, it's been a long journey, but it's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I think that was the prominent advice back in the day was fat was bad. Fat would make you fat. And because you were talking about how your mom ate healthy, a lot of like chicken, broccoli, like lean stuff, maybe rice in there, brown rice, not white rice. And my mom was the same way. Like she did the physique competitions, like almost bodybuilding. She would like meal prep, and it would be so bland. And I remember even her having oats and just eating dry oats straight. And I thought, oh, that's how you be healthy. So I remember even taking those packets, brown sugar oatmeal, which is probably just full of sugar, going to high school and just downing those, in the cafeteria and thinking, oh, I just got to tough it out. And then podcast for me, Vinny Tortorich started learning about like, oh, fat isn't bad. Saturated fat's not going to give you a heart attack. Like cholesterol even is misunderstood. And going down, it was similar to like the Bitcoin rabbit hole, which is, like you said, it's kind of funny how they overlap, how there's so much kind of health voices now in Bitcoin. You got like the Meat Mafia guys here in Austin now, and they're big into, they're like, I think Brett, I don't know if he still does it. He was carnivore, which if you pitched carnivore 10 years ago, people would say, oh, you're going to have a heart attack in a year.
Oh yeah.
So it's great to see that information being put out there and people trying it and seeing, like, once you tried it, you could see the results. Like you can show these studies that, like you're going to get diabetes from eating meat, which make no sense. But when you actually try it and you do it in person and you see you're losing weight, you feel your energy is better. Like, I think that's the best example. So I think people just need to try out different things.
I agree. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the fiat money era has coincided with absolute bogus and BS nutritional guidelines, because it all really comes back to the money and incentives.
Oh yeah.
Essentially what happened was there's a ton of inflation after Nixon depegged gold, or depegged the dollar from gold in 1971. There was a lot of inflation. There was a ton of fear at the time that the dollar was going to fail, which is kind of crazy to think about now, 50 years down the road, and we're still dealing with the almighty dollar.
Yeah.
But so there's a ton of inflation. Essentially, there was this Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, who was hired. his job was really to bring food prices down. So it kind of led to the consolidation of farmland in the U.S., tons of output of grains, and really what ended up happening was to mask inflation, they just started changing the nutritional guidelines. I think the first one was in 1980 where they started promoting a grain-heavy diet, and that was because the U.S. was producing so much grain, and they needed demand for it. It's much cheaper to produce that at industrial scale than it is to meat or dairy. So that's just kind of continued, and I really think it's an insidious way for the government to downplay inflation metrics, because essentially they do different adjustments to CPI and all this, and they will just substitute shittier goods into the CPI for instead of better foods, and then it will understate the amount of inflation that they're reporting.
Yeah, it's a lot cheaper for them, or they want us to eat bugs than use all this land for meat and the subsidies too. Like, weren't there a ton of soybean subsidies? So I wonder what kind of effects that has. So it's a centralizing for it. The central planner decides this is what is good. So we're going to put all this money towards this, and you're forcing people's hand to pay for it. And that's just unjust. And especially when, like you said, all the grains and stuff, it turns out to be not that great for you, but you can thank your government for really pushing that along. So, yeah,
I mean, it continues too. I just saw a video of Eric Adams, who's the mayor in New York. And he was just giving a speech the other day about how he was using some really strong language. He's like, we know for a fact that plant-based diets are the best diet that a human could eat. And New York has these preposterous programs in their public schools. They have vegan Mondays and plant-based Fridays. Maybe I'm switching them up, but they're pushing these plant-based diets into children's, into school in New York. And it's really messed up. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people believe what they're saying, but I also think that there's probably a grander scheme kind of behind the curtains. But this guy, Eric Adams, was really just trying to give a speech to convey that plant-based diet is something that we need to all adopt, because plants are better for humans and because plants are better for the environment as well. He was citing that 20% of CO2 output is from meat and dairy or something in the United States. Just absolute preposterous information that he's spewing.
Yeah. And I think what I get from there is anytime you have a central planner, I don't think he's being, I steal this from Corolla, stupid or liar. So I don't think he's lying. I think he truly believes that. But there's a lot of people that think they know better than everyone else. Like, if only everyone listened to them, everything would be fine. So I think it's Trudeau in Canada that is like, oh, just do what I say and we're going to be great. And he wants all the credit and he wants to be like the man. And that nanny state mentality, I push against that hard. But then there's a lot of people, I think I'm outnumbered. I think there's more people that would rather just be mindless, check out, and just whatever. Okay, yes, government, you say I need to do this, I'll do that. And I'm finding more and more people are going that way and not critically thinking. Do you have any hope for society moving forward, or how do we get out of this? Is it Bitcoin?
I think we need sound money to start actually fixing things, but I think it's quite grim. I mean, I'm going to have to write a piece about this, but I wrote an article that was called The Health of the State and Its Constituents. And the first part of the article that I released already was about how awful the fiscal health is of the United States, and just with all the debt in the system and what the implications are of that. And then I was going to write a part 2 about how awful people's health are, so the constituents of the United States. And it's really bad. I mean, you mentioned critical thinking, and people can't really think critically if they're 100 pounds overweight, right?
Yeah.
If your body's just not functioning, then your mind will not be functioning either. So I think there's just a general sense of apathy in the United States and maybe the West more broadly, but the U.S. seems to be the worst in terms of health. And yeah, a lot of people, I think, are just very complacent in their day-to-day lives. They have no ambition, they have no drive, or they don't really, I guess, have anything that they strive for in the bigger picture, right? It's like, okay, if I can collect money from the government, or I can work a miserable job and listen to music while I do it, and then watch Netflix and maybe go out and drink some beers on the weekend. That's good enough for me, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't really know what's going to happen in the future. I do know that a lot of these issues stem from broken money, where it's just the central banks and the government colluding to expand the money supply and pretty much line their pockets with a ton of money and make life unlivable for the kind of bottom 50%.
Yeah.
Even if that's not their intentions. Like you said, there's a lot of academics who think that they're almighty, right? That they're just omnipotent people, and they're like, all right, I'm just so smart, I can just decide how other people should be living. And so I think that's kind of what Davos is too, like the World Economic Forum. There's definitely some bad actors associated with Davos, but I think a lot of it. What?
That's an understatement.
Yeah. But there's also a lot of people that are in the Davos class that just think that they're better than other people. And because of that, because they're more intelligent or whatever, they can make decisions for 8 billion people.
And I blame the governments and the central planners and the thought leaders more than the people, because I mean, every person is responsible for their own life. But at this point, I feel bad because no one wants to be fat. No one wants to be poor and live paycheck to paycheck. But all these thought leaders that, are people praise are telling you just terrible information. They're telling you like, oh, you can eat sugar and grains and you don't need meat. You can just eat these processed food. You can eat these bugs and be healthy. Or, oh yeah, just, you work and you can save, and maybe one day you'll buy a house. Just keep working hard and saving, and then they're causing inflation, and you can't just save it. You'll never have it. So there's people that are true once, and they see that there's like, I'm doing everything right, I'm doing what I can do, and I'm still not getting anywhere. That's soul crushing. Like they're going to give up. And I think that is the driving factor. So like you said, if we fix the money, that's a step forward in the right direction. And Bitcoin is that shining light, that it's a revolutionary technology, better than, like, I couldn't have thought it up. Like it's truly one of the greatest inventions in my lifetime. I think I always thought the iPhone was the coolest thing ever. It's like, that's life changing. And but now seeing Bitcoin, this has made me more excited than anything else, like technology wise, in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to your point, the first point you were making, life is just unaffordable for people, and there's a lot of confusion about why that is, but it really just comes down to the fact that governments and central banks are printing money. Sometimes they're printing more money than others. Sometimes it happens in big waves, such as 2020 and 2021. But there's a constant currency debasement, which is making life unaffordable for most people. So even if someone wanted to eat healthy, but they were earning minimum wage or close to it, they're not going to be able to. You can't eat healthy making that type of money.
Yeah.
People are having to choose between paying rent and eating food. So it's really a dire situation. I mean, you and I are both obviously doing quite well for ourselves. We're fortunate in a lot of ways that we could even be sitting down and having this conversation and pontificating, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of people, they don't have that luxury. They're trying to get by. They may be months behind on rent, or they're feeding themselves and their children Doritos and ramen. And yeah, it's pretty bad out there for probably 50% plus of the population. I mean, I'm even experiencing myself. I'm not really having any financial struggles, but I told you about thinking about buying a house, and it works right now because both me and my fiance were both working full time. But let's say that in the future we wanted to have a family and we wanted to work down to one income and just have me be the sole provider. I would have to increase my earnings capacity quite a bit to be able to provide for a family.
Yep.
So, 100 years ago, it was not uncommon. It was actually probably the standard for one individual, usually the father, to earn an income and then provide for his wife and for all their children too. And it didn't need to be some crazy, high-flying job. You could do that on virtually any type of income or any career. And now you have to work in finance or technology or law, accounting, some white collar job to even have a shot at making it. And then you also, your spouse is probably working as well. And you definitely had to go to a 4-year schooling program, and maybe you had to even get master's degrees as well.
And it should be the complete opposite, because we have so much technology and innovation. Life should be easier for everyone. They should have more time. That's one of the greatest things about these devices that raise our productivity is it gives us time back. But when you have the fiat system and just all these inefficiencies, the central planning, they just take it right away, and they're stuck in that debt spiral. And
yeah,
I think Bitcoin's the way out.
Exactly. So even though we've had immense productivity gains through technology, that should be affording us more for less, right? Like essentially home prices should be going down. Food prices should be going down. We should have more time to enjoy with our families or friends or do hobbies that we enjoy.
Yeah.
But instead, people are having to work multiple jobs. Their spouses are also working, and they're not making it by. And it's really a sad situation, and it's only because governments and central banks. That blame cannot be pointed on anyone else. I know there's a lot of confusion about capitalism, and it's greedy corporations. Of course, there's greed in corporations, and there's greedy people in capitalism. But capitalism drives up the prosperity and abundance kind of across the board. There will always be inequality, but there will be a lot more inequality on a central banking system that extracts the wealth of 99.9% of people and lines the pockets of 0.1%.
Yeah, I'm all for equality, but equality under the law. Like this equality for outcome thing is insane. But everyone should be playing by the same rules, and that's just not the case. We don't have a free market. So is there? We've gone about an hour here. Is there any other Bitcoin topics you wanted to cover, or anything else in general on hopefully your first of many appearances on the podcast?
I don't think so, Mike. Really appreciate you having me on. I think if anyone wants to get in touch with me, just find me on Twitter at MacroJack21. I'm happy to take any comments, feedback, questions. Looking for like-minded people to connect with. Happy to help out in any capacity that I can. And I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming out and talking about Bitcoin, getting more information out there, because I think even though there's a ton of Bitcoin podcasts, who knows who we'll reach, and as long as if it affects one person's life for the better, I think it's worth it. So thanks a lot. See ya. Thank you for listening to the Mike White Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Mike White Pod, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Y'all have a great day.